What if the experiences of entrepreneurs are shaping the economy, but their neurodivergent experiences are barely appearing in the research used to shape decisions? Throughout history, pioneering researchers have changed public understanding, influenced policy, and overturned ideas that once seemed fixed. That change begins with asking better questions and listening properly to the people living the experience. So, my guest today is Lucy Griffiths, whose research explores what it's actually like to build and run a business as a neurodivergent person. I think I'm just going to let us dive in rather than telling more about what to expect. Suffice to say, this is a really important conversation, and it really explores why qualitative research is so important. Okay, let's go. Welcome to Even the Dog Has ADHD, because apples don't fall far from trees and there's never just one. I am absolutely thrilled to have Lucy with us today, who is a researcher, and she's going to tell us all about the project she is working on currently and why it's so important. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
So, Lucy, why don't we kick off with your pathway to why you decided this research was important? Maybe a little bit about your own journey with
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't discover that I'm neurodivergent until my early 40s. And at the time, I was an entrepreneur. So I had a tech startup. It was a tech startup that was focused on helping people with their career paths. And that was kind of driven by a desire in myself to figure out what it is I wanted to do with my life. I always felt that I hadn't quite figured it out because I didn't quite feel like I fitted anywhere. And in classic style, I decided I would create a business that would help solve that for other people. Wonderful. And so while I was doing that, and it's such an intense experience building a business. It's something that takes a lot out of you, as you well know, as an entrepreneur yourself. And the struggles that I was having during that time were quite different to the ones that I've been having in workplace environments. But at that time, I read an article, and it was an article about somebody who was autistic. And I found myself going, oh, okay, that sounds exactly like me. And it was such a surprise to me. It had never occurred to me before that I might be autistic, but I was ticking everything on that list. And it's even more surprising, I guess, because during the school system, from very early on, I had been identified as somebody who was, what they might call gifted or talented at that time. I saw an educational psychologist from the age of 4 who moved me up a year in school. Nobody even considered neurodivergence of any kind. Nobody even thought of it, whether that's because I was a girl, whether, the stereotype, all of those things. And so I started on this journey. I started on the journey of finding out what was going on with me and kind of reassessing my whole life through the lens of discovering that I'm autistic, or that's the label we put on what I am, I guess. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about labels later on. But I went down the rabbit hole of research, and my default has always been learn as much as you can about a topic, try and educate yourself and figure it out. So I went to the academic research, what's the most credible stuff out there. And maybe I wasn't surprised, but I guess I was concerned to find that I couldn't see myself represented well in that research. And I guess I was particularly looking at research on entrepreneurship and neurodivergence at that time, because I was in that space of being an entrepreneur. And the research there was primarily quantitative in nature. It was almost about, and many of it was much of it was very well intentioned. It was about kind of validating the idea that, neurodivergent people can do entrepreneurship. But I kind of didn't need that validation, and I knew that for myself. What I wasn't seeing there was the lived experience of entrepreneurs, the nuance, the detail, the whole life experience. And so I decided that I would try and fill that gap. And that's why I'm doing the research that I'm doing now.
So exciting. I'm so thrilled that you're doing it, and talking about the complexities of being a neurodivergent entrepreneur, because I think often, and I'm sure you've heard this, the idea that being neurodivergent means you have a superpower. You will take risks, you will problem solve, you will change the world because you see patterns. But not every neurodivergent human wants to be an entrepreneur, is the other thing, isn't it? And that you can be an ordinary human being. You don't have to relate to that idea of superpower.
Yeah, it became such a prevalent kind of trope, if you like, in terms of particularly, I think, links between stereotypes of entrepreneurs with ADHD, dyslexia, and I think the kind of either it's a superpower or it's a massive deficit. Neither of those things capture what the reality of the experience is. And calling it a superpower kind of negates all of the challenges and the struggles that people go through, but equally framing it as a deficit that is something that should be in some way, pathologized, I guess, that medicalized, pathologized language. A lot of people find that really difficult too, and I think it's understanding the whole person helps you see the nuance and the richness of it. And that's why I'm doing my research, why I'm doing qualitative research that enables people to tell their real stories, and in making space for those stories, making those stories, I guess, creating testimony from those stories. It means that hopefully that academic space, which has maybe overvalued something that can be reduced to a statistic, can actually maybe rebalance that a little bit with something that treats people as complex, nuanced individuals.
And what's the title of your research?
So I have a tentative title at the moment, but it's really exploring the lived experiences of neurodivergent entrepreneurs. So what is it like to be a neurodivergent entrepreneur? And my hope is that by hearing those stories and understanding all of the differences in those experiences, but also some of the commonalities and shared experiences, I can create something that will have influence on those who are creating policy, who are developing support networks, who are developing, approaches to funding, those who are providing a resource, those who are educating in this space. Unless we have those stories in a rigorous, credible environment that people go to seek this data, then I think there's something really missing in the research. And if those organizations, those bodies cannot access that data and access it as a reliable, rigorous piece of research, it's unlikely that they will include that in their decision making.
Which is huge. Absolutely huge, isn't it?
Yeah.
So when we think about our daily lived life, are you focusing on, that's the other thing I wanted to ask, is are you focusing on UK entrepreneurial lived experience, or are you doing other countries? Are there any participants in other countries?
There are participants outside the UK. So I've had participants come forward from several other countries, and the research is open to anyone who is neurodivergent, who has been an entrepreneur within the last 5 years, or is currently an entrepreneur. So those are my criteria.
And then, so we were talking about why research is so important, because it influences policy, public policy, and that public policy ultimately influences government decisions, which then influences our lives. Now, I'm just, like, when I think, and you've probably observed this as well, I'm guessing that when we all went into lockdown 6 years ago now, and people were made extremely aware of themselves, because where else could we go? It felt like there was this huge, we were all online.
Yeah.
And that's where we went. And then the online conversations across social networks sort of exploded around neurodivergence. And yet it is still massively underdiagnosed. And I'm thinking also, particularly in women, I was at an International Women's Day, and I was I was a speaker on a panel, and that was a room full of women entrepreneurs. And something that I have observed is that, and through the work that I do, that women, I mean, there's a wonderful line, women hold up half the sky. That was a Mao Zedong original. And then there was a book published, I think 2010, about the economic importance of educating and empowering and equipping women. Made that phrase quite a global, it permeated global thought now. I think hopefully it's a phrase you might have heard of. And I kind of feel that when you are competent and capable and coping externally, that it can be really hard as a woman in terms of self-care and taking care of yourself to even begin to think about exploring the possibility of being a neurodivergent woman. And that can feel quite scary. And I have met many, many entrepreneurs that can relate to the neurodivergent traits that they witness perhaps in their own children, perhaps their partner.
Yeah.
But because their life is working for them, it's almost, they don't want a diagnosis, in a nutshell. And but they will identify with neurodivergent traits, usually the strengths, but also sort of, there are echoes that I've witnessed within the entrepreneurial community of a bazillion and one thoughts, that not necessarily having the structure to hold all of those ideas to make it all happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're sort of tipping into the strains. And I can think of one entrepreneur who says repeatedly, entrepreneurs are brilliant at making money, they're not good at managing money, which is something a lot of people seem to resonate in the rooms that I've witnessed that. So with the research, what kind of, when you're interviewing participants, how has it, if you're allowed to talk about it, how has it been for them to be able to share their story and to be part of this research, part of this narrative that you're documenting?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think the first thing that I would say around that choice around diagnosis, I think it is such a complex picture and such a personal and individual choice and a journey that people are on. In my own case, I found it really, I don't want to use the word useful, that's maybe not the word, but I found it really, it just explained everything, I guess. It was so helpful to me to have a lens through which to reflect on my previous experiences, my experiences as an entrepreneur. And I think one way that we reflect on our experience is through telling our stories. And so, I've found that as I've started doing this research and I've started, putting out my calls for participants to come forward, people have been really, they've really wanted to tell their stories. It's a hard thing to do also, and it's something that I think is, is quite a demanding thing for neurodivergent people in particular, to kind of walk through things that have been quite painful to them potentially in their past, things that they've really struggled with. But what I get is that sense that people feel that it's so important that these stories are told, that they are absolutely ready and willing to step forward and share those experiences that they have, because I think, like me, they want to see that influencing decisions that are made, and they want that kind of on the record that this is what's happening and this is how it has been. And that's, I think, also about making sure that, the future isn't the same as the past has been for people who are neurodivergent and making their way in the world, as many of us have, without that piece of knowledge that could have made things different for us.
That's that what you said about people telling their stories and being heard, really heard, and having that documented in terms of advocating for positive support structures,
yeah
whatever that looks like. My head jumps straight to educational reform all the time. Just goes
yes
there.
Yeah, huge passion of mine as well, and something that I think we need to always be thinking about, because the world is changing around us, and education needs to shift with those shifting patterns. And I think many of those patterns within education have been in place for a very long time without necessarily being questioned, or challenged. There are lots of assumptions about how education works that maybe make it harder for some people to thrive in our education system.
I think it can be hard for the majority of people, actually, when I'm thinking about secondary, just this class sizes,
Mm-hmm.
the physiological being still with small children. That, yeah, it's huge in terms of challenging, and
Mm.
the future of work is changing so rapidly, and
Yeah.
um,
I did a TEDx talk on redesigning our education system a few years back, and it was actually inspired by, I don't know if you saw Sir Ken Robinson's,
yes, RSA
yeah,
Animate. I'll put the link with this podcast.
yeah, he's a big hero of mine. I think he had it so right. But if you think about it, that was, more than a decade, probably getting
It
on for nearly 20 years ago now.
was it 20? I was
I think
thinking
it was
two.
about 2008, maybe 2006, 2008,
Yeah.
something like that. It's a
Oh my
long
gosh, we
time.
really are near heading towards, gosh, we are
Mm,
heading towards 20 years.
yeah. And what has changed, if you watch that today, change won't have been that great, I don't think.
Oh, and one of the stories, because it's really helpful maybe for people to, as we've been talking about people's stories, one of the stories that Sir Ken Robinson, incredible human being, it was his RSA Animate, which is the Royal Society of Arts, Manufacturing and Commerce.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
uh,
I'm a fellow and I was a trustee, so I know the institution very well. Yeah.
and I've just joined
Have
because
you?
of that
Excellent.
video, because
Hmm.
of that. So it was, so a bit of history for you if you're listening. Royal Society of Arts, Manufacturing and Commerce started during the radical enlightenment period in the 1700s, when people would get together in these newfangled coffee shops and
Hmm.
share thoughts and ideas to see change, positive change to developing in society. And that's gone on, and that became this institution, and a spin-off from that was the Royal Society of Arts. And it's kind of what I get so excited about. It's kind of a renaissance approach to humanity. It's not separating science and arts over there. It's about how there is cross pollination across disciplines. And it still holds those values massively. And um, probably we need to be shouting about it a bit more. Um, so that's, yeah, I got all excited about that there. It's a big passion of mine, and I think that's where sort of bringing together people across, with that Renaissance thought in mind, bringing together. I feel that artificial intelligence and the different platforms within it has the potential. I think that people who've been campaigning really hard for education reform for a very long time, and I think entrepreneurs and parents of children with additional educational needs specifically, because when you are inclusive and more inclusive and you're kinder with inclusive approaches, it's just kinder for everybody.
Mm.
Everybody benefits then,
Yeah.
everyone does. And I think bringing all of that diverse thought and thinking together has the potential to create a more rapid rate of change. That I'll get off my
No,
soapbox now,
no.
but I feel it so passionately.
Mm.
And there is a real need for rigor still in research. And over the last 24 hours, I've been in a lot of spaces where we've been talking about AI, um, at a book launch at Oxford University, and AI and the economic impact and how it's being used at various levels in various ways. And then at an entrepreneur gathering about the potential of AI in terms of autonomy and empowerment. And I came, although the book launch, where there was this academic rigor and discourse, and the professor presenting has got quite a long history in machine learning.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the entrepreneurial space, where we had an AI strategic thinker, I was more scared on the first one, where how it's going to impact our world, and it started off with don't be scared, but by the end of it I was scared. And then in the entrepreneurial space, and particularly a neurodivergent conversation that I was bringing to the table, I find it enormously empowering and equipping as a
Yeah,
tool.
it's really exciting that as something that can provide support in a slightly different way than pretty much anything else that's out there. That level of, you know, relatively personal engagement that you can have. And, I know there's a big debate about um, anthropomorphizing AI and us maybe becoming too reliant on AI tools. But I think I'm a great pragmatist. If it works for you, and I know that I'm seeing this working for a lot of people, where they find these tools super helpful to them. My personal experience with working with AIs, um, I I feel that it's a place where you can ask questions that in the the rest of the world, particularly I think, as a neurodivergent person myself, sometimes because I feel this kind of disconnect or misfit kind of feeling in the world, there are questions that I feel like, is it okay to ask that? And I over question myself, and I've learned to, overanalyze what I say, what I ask, what I write, because the feedback I've sometimes got from the world has been, that seems odd, or you're different somehow. And with an AI, you don't feel that same pressure or concern, so you can ask your question without wondering what the social consequences will be for you. And that's my own personal experience with it. But it just, it's one example of a way in which these tools can, create value that may not even have been thought of by the people who created them. And I think there's something so exciting about unearthing that and discovering how people are using these tools in a really positive way. Yes, of course, there's potential for negative impacts, and we need to kind of hold that tension and understand that, and be ready to, put in place regulation where it's needed, and to act in ways that are ethically sound. But we shouldn't let the fear prevent us from seeing the enormous potential.
And the thought has just popped out of my head. Oh my gosh, it's run away from me.
This happens. It's perfectly normal. Happens to me all the time. And you'll remember it later.
Yeah, I remember it later, but it was to do with AI. Oh, there was a conversation last night, like literally, and it's just gone. I'm going to just have to let that one run away from me.
Absolutely.
Um, so just thinking in terms of research impacting policy,
Mm-hmm.
um, when I think about, I'm just looking at a picture of Lorna Wing, who is the
Hmm.
pioneer of the autism spectrum. And I think one of the things when I was researching who she is, was it took the blame away from mothers for being cold mothers. I mean, it was at one point believed that autism was caused by a lack of bonding between the mother and child. Um, and how long ago her work was to then affect change and thought and policy. And then more recently, thinking about Patricia Quinn, who was one of the first people I came across who about 2010, 2009, she published a book where she's a pediatric doctor and recognized ADHD in girls as well. And just thinking about how long does it take? Are we speeding up the impact of change through research?
Mm. That's a really, really good question. Um, and I think there are a couple of answers to this. I think if you look at the big arc of the history of research into neurodivergence, then you can see that it's been a rocky journey, and a journey where when you look back at some of the work out there, it feels like there was, nature abhors a vacuum, right? So the vacuum gets filled with things that are perhaps hypotheses that later research builds on and is able to maybe move aside. And we've had perhaps, as I've said, an imbalance in the history of this research that has meant that it has focused on particular groups. The majority of the research has focused on particular groups. And that's created stereotypes and tropes around uh, neurodivergences of various kinds. What I think is wonderful, though, is that we are seeing more and more research in this space, and the more that we do, the more that we know, and the more research that we get that is cross-discipline and takes into account, from what we were talking about earlier around the importance of drawing on a range of different disciplines. These different disciplines have a lot to offer each other. Where there's, bodies of research that have developed independently, they bringing them together is really exciting, because you get to critique each other's work, you get to create that challenge and that kind of tension that results in better understanding. And that's what we as researchers should all be seeking, is a better understanding of this. So I'm really, I'm excited about some of the research that's being done at the moment. There are some fabulous researchers out there, people like Nancy Doyle, Monique Botha, some really amazing studies and perspectives on this, and we need to consider all of those perspectives. My hope is that my research provides another block in that wall, if you like, that I can contribute to that in some way. I'm hopeful for the future of this research, I guess, is the point that I would make. And I see this kind of critical mass of people coming forward who are researching it because they have experienced it. So you have, researchers who are neurodivergent themselves and who are co-designing their research with their participants. That's something that I'm doing in my research. And so what you get then is research that doesn't miss the bits that researchers who haven't had that experience just wouldn't know about. They wouldn't know to ask those questions because they haven't lived it.
Yeah, that, yeah, I can, gosh, my mind's about to go in about three different directions about the sort of, so I can think it echoes in many different ways on different areas of lived experience. Who's in charge of policy and those policy making policy decisions for
Mm.
people, or that they don't have a depth of understanding because they haven't um, sought to hear the voices or heard the problems, so they try and fix the problems without understanding the problems, if that makes sense. Um,
Yeah, and I think um, what's often easiest for policymakers is to see a statistic and use that as the basis for decision making. It's they become these shorthands for the story when actually the story behind that number may be incredibly varied, nuanced, and you have to unpick who is represented in that number, and that's why I think balancing the quantitative with qualitative research is so important, and getting that work published in academic journals that are the places that these policymakers feel they can go for reliable data on which to base their choices. And so, whilst I'm not saying that quantitative research is bad, it's absolutely not, and there is a place in this for quantitative research, but we don't have enough qualitative research to sit alongside that to really be able to fully understand what's going on. I mean, an example for me. My background has been in marketing. As marketers, we look at our dashboards, we look at our data, we look at the analytics on the screen, and you see all, the numbers go up, the numbers go down. What that doesn't tell you is why that person chose your product on a particular day in their life when they're doing something that you can't know about unless you ask them. And if you ask them and hear their story, you start to understand the real motivation behind that purchase. And I see this as the same thing. The number just gives you a clue as to where you might want to take your question.
Now, something you just said about publishing in places that policymakers find reliable to go to, those places, in my experience and understanding, are often gated. So that means you have to pay some ginormous subscription,
Yeah.
and then open access publishing then isn't as well regarded, but then humanity's got the access to that research.
Yeah.
And yet policymakers, it's like paying the more expensive price, perceived value.
Indeed. Yeah, and it is one of those challenges in academic research and publishing. Certainly, as researchers, most researchers want their research to reach as many people as possible, and they also want it to reach the people who have enough power to make decisions as part of that group. And certainly, what I'm seeing in the sector is more encouragement from within universities for and more support for academics to publish in open access publications. So I see that is something that is shifting. But you are right that there is also a set of publishers who put some work behind paywalls that make them really hard for the public outside of academic institutions to access. And I think the more that we can do to encourage more open access availability, but also to consider the those publications and those routes that are maybe behind those paywalls, find ways in which the messages from those can be shared more widely, and even if there isn't, not everybody's able to access everything and the full detail, the messages can still be shared publicly through engagement with the public, researchers going out there and sharing their findings. So that's something that I'm really keen to do. I think there are lots of people out there who are doing amazing work in talking about this topic and advocating, telling those stories in the wider world. I guess my big mission and my challenge is, how do I get, you say it gated, there's gated in terms of the paywall to access, but there's also gatekeeping around being able to publish and having your research considered as valid to be published in those top journals as well. And so that's the other challenge that I'm kind of trying to address. And I do that by making sure my research is as rigorous and defensible as possible, and for making the case for qualitative research, as in the ways that we've talked about today, and making the case for its real value and its right to sit alongside that quantitative research that quite often gets privileged.
So as we kind of draw to a close, there's a few things that I wonder, what would you love for I guess public policy, people who work around public policy, to take away from your intention with your qualitative research? And then what would you love for someone who perhaps is already an academic, I can't think what field, in terms of encouraging them? You talked at one bit about seeing the whole person and across disciplines, to be encouraging somebody that it lives, breathes academia. What would you love for them to think about? So about public policy, and then people within academia. I couldn't even point a finger at what part of academia and what part of research, because of this whole notion of the whole. If we think about clinical medicine, if we think about psychology, if we think, I don't know, like,
Yeah. So look, I have personal opinions about policy, and I don't think it's right for me to necessarily say what I think should happen in terms of the policy decisions. But what I would like policymakers to do is to make sure that they are thinking about the real lived experience of individuals when they're considering policy, and that they're not simply looking for the research that reduces individuals to a statistic or a set of numbers. And I think when making policy decisions, looking at some of those researchers and those projects that are out there that are taking these qualitative approaches that are more nuanced, that show the richer experiences. And it's hard to do, it's not easy. It's the thing that actually makes the work a little bit harder, but I promise you the outcome will be better if you take the time to do that work and to engage and involve neurodivergent people in those decisions. And engaging with this kind of research is one way that you can hear those voices and and ensure they are included. Your second question was about academics, and I think that this idea of bringing people together across disciplines, I would love to see more multidisciplinary projects in this space. In particular, I would really love to see people who are engaged in clinical research, medical research, engaging with the community of researchers that are studying neurodivergence from a range of different perspectives. So the lived experience, those in the social sciences, those in the humanities who are engaging with this. And I would love to see researchers from those different disciplines working together, sharing perspectives. And I think there could be some really super exciting and valuable research that could come out of those collaborations rather than operating in subject-based silos. And unfortunately, it's not always the case that there's the support from a resource perspective for those things. And I guess my other appeal then to those in power who are making decisions about what research gets funded is to look to support or fund or create opportunities for projects that cross the disciplines to happen.
Awesome. I'm going to wave some flags for all of that.
Sorry, that was my soapbox moment there.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. Really inspiring. Really so lovely to sit with you and hear about why it is so important to do qualitative research in the area of neurodivergent lived experience. And I guess I know you're focused on the entrepreneurial space, but there are going to be things within there that affect people who are not entrepreneurial but have those same experiences within a corporate environment or an institution. There will be echoes of thought, and the fact that you are documenting stories in that way, I am sure those stories will be really relatable to a lot of people. Once people start sharing their lived experience and someone can hear their own voice within that, like going back to right at the beginning when you shared reading the article on the autistic experience and how much you were able to relate to that, and how your diagnosis and that kind of awakening of self,
Yes,
having a narrative, having a reason to explain your internal world, because I'm hearing the external world, no one was requiring an explanation, excelling, like go up a year and do all the rest of it, but it's your internal world that was really impacted by reading that story and pursuing a diagnosis.
yeah, and I guess that's probably what's driving me here. I've had that experience where I've had this moment of revelation. Oh, that's why. And if somebody were to read my research and have a similar experience that helped them make sense of what had happened in their life, then I think that in itself, if one person does that, fabulous. That's a result. I think that whole period of my life where I found that out, it just caused this huge ability to just reassess everything, and particularly I think, as you say, performing, being fine, being doing well at school, all of those things, I learned to perform it. I learned to be somebody who could present that picture that I felt the world needed to see. And the internal cost was high, but I hadn't even accounted. I hadn't counted that cost until I had that moment where I kind of looked back and saw all of the pieces fall into place and realized that this was why.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you for being so open and sharing what's driving you with this research. And where can people find out more about your research or other research? Is there somewhere we can signpost people?
I think probably the best place is my LinkedIn. So if you search for Lucy Griffiths UK on LinkedIn, you should find me. You will see my face there. I share my my thoughts about my research there, but also calls for participants, and I'll be sharing updates as I go through this process. So yeah, look for me on LinkedIn.
Thank you.
Oh, thank
So,
you. Thank you for having me.
oh, it's been such a pleasure.
Likewise.
And I hope you've gleaned from this episode how pioneering research has changed public understanding, challenged damaging assumptions, and shaped public policy. Just based on some of the other researchers that we've mentioned, and all those links will be in the show notes. So really encourage you to have a little explore for yourself. And Lucy's research continues in that very tradition by asking what it's actually like to build and run a business with a neurodivergent mind. Because behind every conversation about policy, funding, and economic contribution is a human being seeking to turn their ideas into a business that works without exhausting themselves in the process. And that is also at the heart of my coaching practice. I work with neurodivergent entrepreneurs who are capable of even more than their current circumstances reflect. You can find out more about Lucy's research and my coaching practice in the show notes. And you can have another explore at eventhedoghasadhd.com, where there are even more episodes that reflect and explore the entrepreneurial experience with a neurodivergent mind, diagnosed or not. So apples don't fall far from trees, and there's never just one. And I forgot to say, like, comment, and share. Share with another entrepreneur, someone thinking about entrepreneurship, perhaps a researcher, perhaps a policymaker, and perhaps a funder.